Russian troops stationed in Ukrainian territory are attacked by the Belarusian army on the border between Ukraine and Belarus. Belarusian forces surrounded Russian soldiers who had been stationed there as part of a partial mobilization. Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, made some harsh remarks against Alexander Lukashenko. Is it possible that the alliance between Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko will end soon? The deaths that the Russian army has suffered while fighting in Ukrainian territory have directly increased the resentment that the Russian people and government officials already feel toward Vladimir Putin, despite the fact that these individuals do not want to fight alongside the Ukrainian army. Putin continues to dispatch Russian citizens who are coercively enlisted into the Russian army through partial mobilization to Ukrainian territory. Currently, the Ukrainian force has over 300,000 Russian soldiers on staff. Putin believed that by taking this step, the Russian military would become significantly stronger. But he was mistaken. Russian soldiers who have been stationed in Ukraine for a long time and are struggling to survive there are in a very bad mental state. It is well known that the Russian military finds it extremely difficult to make sense of the information it receives from sources in the area. Despite Putin's efforts to keep this information hidden from the Russian people and the rest of the world, over 1,000 Russian soldiers have tried to flee Ukrainian territory while serving in the Russian army over the course of the last few months alone. Russian troops who are finding it difficult to cope with the appalling conditions on the battlefield are making an effort to leave Ukraine and seek safety abroad. According to Vladimir Putin's newly passed legislation, Russian troops who try to flee the battlefield or rebel against the army face prison terms of 5 to 10 years. As a consequence, Russian combatants who are aware that they cannot leave the conflict and return to Russia have two options available to them. Either they'll surrender to the Ukrainian military, as many Russian soldiers have already done, or they'll transfer to one of the nearby nations. In the past, a sizable number of Russian fighters and leaders in Ukraine have managed to avoid capture. One individual who matches this description is the recent recipient of asylum in Norway, the Russian general Andrei Medvedev. Even though their contract has ended, thousands of individuals, including Medvedev, the Wagner commander, are still unable to leave Ukraine. Medvedev is merely one illustration. The world was shocked by the revelations made by the Russian commander who had sought asylum in Norway and announced that he would testify for the war crimes committed by the Russian army on Ukrainian land. Medvedev made that remark. Wagner, the company's CEO, and Vladimir Putin will be the targets of his utmost efforts to subject them to justice. The fact that even Russian commanders have started to leave territory inside Ukraine has had a significant effect on other Russian soldiers who are fighting there. Soldiers from the Russian base on the Ukrainian border who were engaged in combat left their outposts and made an effort to cross into Belarus. These soldiers have started to appear and declare that they do not wish to engage in combat with Russian troops stationed at the Russian headquarters on the Ukrainian frontier. On the other hand, the Belarusian army, which is in charge of securing the border with Russia and Belarus, killed 60 Russian personnel who were trying to flee on the Belarusian side of the international border in Warwickshire. Frame is one of the outposts of the Russian soldiers who laid down their weapons and declined to engage in combat. There has been a large battle between Russian soldiers and Wagner soldiers in this outpost where there are many Russian soldiers stationed over the course of the last few weeks. These soldiers complained that they had not been used in any operations and that their basic needs were not being met after reporting for service as part of a partial mobilization. According to the Russian soldiers, the Wagner soldiers treated them like second-class soldiers and only permitted them to eat one meal each day, while the Wagner soldiers were provided with 3 meals each day. In comparison to the Wagner soldiers, The Russian soldiers were also made to consume less food. According to the allegations, the Wagner troops stole the majority of the supplies that were brought to the headquarters, while the Russian recruits received only what they needed to survive. When the recruits could take it no longer, they confronted the Wagner troops and demanded that they be granted their rights. The Wagnerian warriors and the Russians, on the other hand, fought significant combat. A week or so after this battle was over, Russian forces abandoned their headquarters and tried to cross into Belarusian territory to reach Ukrainian territory. However, 60 Russian soldiers were killed by the Belarusian army because the Russian soldiers disobeyed the order to halt in the dead of night. The Russian troops scaled the barbed wire surrounding the headquarters to make their getaway. The Russian troops reached the Belarusian border after a lengthy journey. The Russian troops have left their military gear and weapons in the forest and are planning to flee to a more familiar area. The events that actually took place, however, totally derailed the plans of the Russian warriors. Russian troops who thought they could cross the border into Belarus and territory by taking advantage of the night's darkness were apprehended by the Belarusian military when the Russian troops disregarded the Belarusian soldiers. Warning to stop, the Belarusian army began firing on the Russian soldiers. The Belarusian soldiers instantly started attacking the Russian soldiers without even flinching. The commander of the Belarusian army fell into a state of terror when it was realized that the 60 troops who had been eliminated in a matter of minutes were members of the Russian army. They believed the troops who were running were Russian soldiers, according to the story the Belarusian commander gave to his farrier. The situation grew even more challenging to comprehend. Following the Russian government's discovery that the Belarusian army had killed 60 Russian troops, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had harsh words for Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. According to Shoigu, the Belarusian army is made up of untrained soldiers who have no notion how to wage war. Shoigu insisted on bringing to justice the Belarusian troops who opened fire on the Russian soldiers despite the fact that the Russian soldiers did not even return fire. It is extremely doubtful that this error by the Belarusian forces will cause tensions between Alexander Lukashenko and Vladimir Putin. The head of staff for the Russian government, Valery Gerasimov, recently made some remarks that everyone found surprising. These comments were made at a time when the Russian populace is furious with the Belarusian government. According to Gerasimov, the Belarusian army punished the 60 Russian soldiers who tried to flee the conflict and refused to fight. He felt that such soldiers should be punished. Gerasimov added that he thought the Belarusian army was responsible for punishing the 60 troops. The harsh language used by the Russian people in response to Gerasimov's cruel comments reflects their extreme rage on different social media sites. Russian citizens started petitions with the goal of getting Gerasimov fired, and they gathered signatures. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, did not accede to this request made by the Russian people. It would seem that Vladimir Putin and whoever the director of the general staff is operate along very similar lines. The number of Russian soldiers making attempts to flee the conflict in Ukraine has considerably increased in recent weeks. Mutinies among Russian escorters have considerably increased, especially among staff members who are members of racial or ethnic minorities. Vladimir Putin's decision to partly mobilize the army has enraged members of minority groups because the vast majority of the soldiers included in the decision are from minority groups. Minority members who want to react to the situation have gone to the streets and started planning protests against Putin and the war. These protests spread across the nation after starting in independent nations like Crimea, in Dagestan, Karelia and Tatarstan. Riots are being put down by Vladimir Putin, but none of these protests are important to him. Putin's only goal is to increase enlistments in order to expand the size of Russia's armed forces. Only Ramzan Kadyrov, a native of the Russian Independent Republic of Chechnya, supports Vladimir Putin. Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, has sent a sizable number of Chechen troops to Ukraine to show off his close friendship with Vladimir Putin. A journey to Ukraine was made by tens of thousands of Chechen troops under the direction of Ramzan Kadyrov. These Chechen fighters, however, don't seem to be interested in fighting either Chechen and Wagner. Troops, who are heavily represented on the backward front, have recently had some conflicts. There are a lot of these troops here. For the Russian army, the fact that the vast majority of Wagner soldiers are presently being held as prisoners has started to create problems. The Chechen troops who see the Wagner soldiers as their oppressors are outraged by the racist actions of the Wagner soldiers against the Chechen soldiers. However, Chechen soldiers are compelled to take part in the conflict in Ukraine as a consequence of Ramzan Kadyrov order. Not every Chechen soldier, however, is fighting alongside Russian forces in this war. The Ukrainian army is presently engaged in combat alongside unaffiliated Chechen units. Numerous Chechen fighters are actively participating in the battle against Russian forces with the Ukrainian army. These Chechen troops resist Ramzan Kadyrov rule. The Ukrainian army frequently conducts military operations against the occupying Russian army's ammunition depots, military production facilities, and military sites. Russia presently faces a greater shortage of ammunition as a result of the actions taken by the Ukrainian army. In addition to the operations the Ukrainian army is conducting, drunken Russian troops are complicating the work of the Russian army by engaging in actions that are beyond comprehension. The number of unexplainable events that have occurred on Russian soil has significantly increased since the war began. There have been a number of explosions and fires lately at various factories that produce weapons and other military supplies. Additionally, the number of unthinkable acts carried out by Russian troops has increased. Additionally, all of these incidents happened consecutively during the prior week. The already severe shortage of ammunition in the Russian army has gotten even worse as a result of these actions. Extensive damage. A drunk Russian soldier accidentally shot himself up with a bump. It was just a fortunate coincidence that one of Russia's most important businesses experienced a fire the following day. Let's examine these two instances more closely, shall we? In order to continue the conflict, Putin, the head of the occupying force, is using unconventional tactics because there are so few warriors available. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has even started sending convicts to the front lines. Putin may have also used female prisoners in recent operations. According to rumors, Putin is having trouble finding troops to fight on the front lines. Putin keeps a few troops at the front lines and supplies them with alcohol on a constant basis to keep them fighting. The Russian army allows its troops to drink as much alcohol as they want, even though it is unable to arm its soldiers with sufficient fighting tools. Russian soldiers with alcohol addiction do not want to leave the front lines as a consequence of Putin's policy of primarily deploying underprivileged Russians there. Many Russian troops who become alcohol addicts do not want to go back to their civilian lives because they find it difficult to drink alcohol as easily. The Russian military provides alcoholic drinks to its soldiers for yet another reason. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is reportedly unable to provide his soldiers with winter camouflage, which would prevent them from perishing in the extreme cold on Ukrainian soil. Many troops on the front lines succumb to hypothermia and pass away before they have a chance to fire a shot. Putin, who is worried that this will occur, warns the troops by providing them with alcohol on icy winter days. The troops are drinking vodka to keep themselves warm in the chilly weather. Putin's temporary solution is actually making things worse for him. Soldiers who regularly consume alcohol act in a way that suggests they are unaware of their actions at the front. In reality, the actions of drunk Russian soldiers served as a demonstration of this in order to participate in the Donetsk Go Blasting event. A Russian man by the name of Kirill enrolled in the Russian military. Kirill's existence was almost constantly dominated by alcohol on the battlefield. The inebriated Russian soldier did not get along with other soldiers or leaders. In fact, the commanders left him alone because of how poorly he interacted with others. He wasn't even given tasks to finish. He was consuming vodka, chatting on the phone non-stop, hanging out with friends and abusing social media while intoxicated. Hero, a drunken Russian officer, decided to join his friends out of the blue when the hero could no longer stand. He snatched a backpack and made camp without telling anyone in the front. The hero was frequently in peril of a collision during the 4 kilometers of drunken driving, just in time to see his friends having a good time at the party. Kirill arrived at his friend's house. The glimpse of the uniformed Russian soldier waiting at the entrance startled those who saw it. Those who had been observing the inebriated soldier for a considerable time felt a great deal of terror when Kirill opened his suitcase. The inebriated Russian officer unzipped the bag he had brought and took out a grenade. His companions began making a lot of noise and running out of the house as soon as they saw the grenade. Kirill, who had been drinking alcohol and sitting in the front, began acting in a manner that suggested he was no longer bothered by the situation. As soon as the soldiers took up the grenade, they began swaying to the loud music. The pin was taken out of the explosive by Kirill, who was reportedly mesmerized by the music at the moment. If he had held the grenade even a little bit more carelessly, or if it had simply slipped out of his hand, it could have been a major disaster. However, Kirill, the inebriated Russian soldier, did not possess the required mental capacity to entertain such an idea. The conflict has significantly damaged Kirill's mental health, and he suddenly hurled the grenade at a mirror that was reflecting what he was doing. Kirill continued to act densely, totally oblivious to the grenade. All of a sudden, there was a huge explosion. The power of the explosion forced Kirill, a Russian soldier, from his position, and he fell across the room. His friends were in utter terror after the explosion. It's unknown what drove Kirill to take such drastic action. The conflict could only be the cause of the total destruction of the psychological well-being of the Russian soldiers deployed to the front. When they returned to the home after the explosion and discovered Kirill, they realized he was hurt, so they assisted him in getting to the closest hospital. The reason Kirill committed this act is not entirely obvious. There are many other instances of drunken Russian troops acting in similar ways to what Kirill did. Putin has been forced to move as a result of the actions of inebriated Russian soldiers, despite the fact that these actions have significantly increased the number of issues at the front. Russia also experienced a second incident. The event that occurred today also took place after Kirill detonated a suicide bomb at Russia's largest facility for the manufacture of explosives. The plant that manufactures explosives for the Russian army in Chapayevsk, Samara Oblast, caught fire in a massive fire. The building was soon covered in flames. Bombs were being produced by a sizable explosives factory in the Samara Oblast for use by the occupying troops in Ukraine. The Ukraine was the planned target of these bombs. Many people consider the Chapel's mechanical plant, also referred to as the plant, to be the brains of Russia's aerospace and defense sectors. Putin experienced a shortage of ammunition as a result of the Ukrainian army conducting operations almost daily targeted at ammunition depots and supply routes. As a result, at this factory, which makes very important explosives and detonators, began producing more on Putin's orders. The Ukrainian army was the cause of Putin's ammunition scarcity, which is why this happened. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, knew how important it was to keep the war continuing so that this factory's production never ceased. However, there was a fire that began in the structure, and its origin has not yet been identified. The situation was already critical due to the fact that the fire started during business hours and while manufacturing was still going on. The fire caused a significant portion of the explosive materials that were kept in the factory to abruptly catch fire and detonate with a loud bang. A large number of workers managed to escape the roaring fire. Unfortunately, the incident resulted in the death of a 46-year-old woman. 3 additional people were hurt as a consequence of the incident. The cause of the fire has not been satisfactorily explained by Russian officials. According to some Russian reports, the explosion was caused by the explosion of an explosives-containing device with detonator caps affixed. According to many analysts, it's conceivable that these explosions were caused by rebels fighting against their subjugation in Russia or Ukraine. Putin is very concerned about this plant, so it is unclear what started the fire there. It is well known that the Ukrainian army or other military sabotage groups destroyed a significant number of Russian military bases, ammunition and fuel depots on Russian soil, including the occupied territories. Russia is having a lot of trouble on the battlefield as a consequence of the success of these operations. Currently, there is a shortage of ammunition in Putin's forces. Russian military factories, supply lines and ammunition depots must be destroyed in order to liberate the Ukrainian land. This is because the Russian force, which is suffering from a shortage of ammunition, is no longer able to fight. The Western and European nations have supplied the Ukrainian army with weapons and ammunition, which has allowed it to surpass the Russian army's degree of readiness. The war has totally derailed everything that Putin had planned before it started. Putin, the president of Russia, was totally powerless in the face of the Ukrainian forces. Tenacious resistance. The latest statement made public by the Ukrainian armed forces claims that the number of Russian troops lost has steadily increased as a result of the number of soldiers slain in the past day. The Russian troops have suffered more than 165,000 casualties today. These losses prevent the Russian army from participating in this battle any longer. What do you think about Russian troops regularly consuming alcohol while engaged in combat on the front lines? Do you have any theories as to why Kirill, a drunk Russian soldier, chose to blow himself up with a grenade? Will Putin be able to continue this conflict? It's conceivable that these developments will result in the end of the war. Your opinion is something that we're interested in hearing. Clicking the Super Thanks button will help support our efforts as a team, and you can follow us for updates on our progress. An unexpected move by Japanese tanks has brought the conflict between Japan and Russia into land that is presently under Ukrainian control. Russian vehicles were destroyed by Ukrainian troops on Ukrainian territory. The Russians weren't sure what to do next. Japan started to participate more actively in the final days of the Russian-Ukrainian war. After this action by the Ukrainian army, these shocking events have brought the degree of hostility between Japan and Russia to a completely new height. Japan used its public statements as a means of threatening Putin. Putin started to move in a variety of ways after receiving these warnings. The ongoing political conflict between Japan and Russia has progressed to a completely new level. The present situation was made possible by Russia's unjust dominance over the Kuril Islands that had established a number of years ago. This event, which has left everyone on Earth perplexed, has already begun to have a major impact. After these events, Japan started to approach Ukraine in a new way. The conflict has now shifted its emphasis to a new front. As a result of Japan's decision to support the Ukraine in its opposition to Russia's actions in the area, the G7 nations' decisions have given the Ukraine access to the weapons and ammunition it needs to put an end to the war. Putin has chosen to move, though, in response to these most recent events. To begin with, he made a firm decision to send his naval troops stationed in the Baltic region to the Kuril Islands and gave the order for destroyer ships to go there as well. Putin has opened the door for a war to occur with this action in retaliation for this move, which illegally entered Japanese territorial waters. This action was taken by the Japanese. Japan decided to discuss some issues with the other G7 members during a meeting. The conclusion was that if Russian troops were stationed in this area, Japan would launch an attack. 5 destroyer ships were sent in this way by the Japanese military. The actions these ships took on the sea could have very serious consequences, despite their intention to terrorize the Russian military. As a result, the Ukrainian fighters came up with a very distinctive plan of action. Zelensky sat down for talks with Japan to make the most of the Russian army's position in that area. He then took action to obtain a very different kind of backing. Putin wasn't sure what to do. After learning about the support, though, the Ukrainian army began to offer assistance as Japan started to take various actions, one after another, keeping the Russian naval flotilla occupied in this area. A sizable number of tanks from Japan have been sent to Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has decided to coordinate an operation using both these tanks and the ones that were recently delivered to them, especially in areas that are strategically significant. The Ukrainian army intended to set up a very straightforward operation to take advantage of the circumstances because Russia was entirely concentrated on that side. A sizable number of tanks were ready in solidar for mobilization in order to retaliate against the occupation forces in this area due to the tensions with Japan for a while. Additionally, the majority of the soldiers that would be sent to that area were recruited from Solidarnosc, and the Ukrainian army had crucial information in the event of a possible conflict with Japan. Furthermore, Solidarity was used to recruit the bulk of the troops that would be sent to that area. As a result, the Ukrainian army was aware of the small number of soldiers stationed on Solidarity movement territory. The Russian army was unaware that the tanks in this area were from the Soviet Union. So when Ukrainian troops invaded this area with a large number of modern tanks, they surprised them. The T-90 encountered a serious impasse during this mission in which they made aggressive use of Japanese Type 90 tanks that they had purchased from Japan. Despite the fact that these tanks were too powerful to keep up with contemporary warfare, the situation drastically changed when the resourceful Ukrainian army arrived. The Ukrainian army used a new approach. This time they brought the T-90 that the Russian army had abandoned at the front, which caught the Russians' attention when they decided to launch an offensive. The American tanks eventually destroyed every Russian tank that was crammed in between them. Following this, some Russian infantry made an effort to fight back, but the Ukrainian special forces were able to decisively beat the Russian army. Following that, it was even clearer that the Ukrainian army and Solda were in charge, and Putin was enraged by it. He decided to give North Korea regional support in response to Japan's action, which posed a threat to everyone else in that area. With this action, Russia has chosen to start a third world war, which is actually what it wanted to do, completed the required action. In advance of making a crucial choice regarding Ukraine, Russia had started to take some actions. However, Russia was left defenseless as a result of how dominant the Ukrainian army was in the area. The Russian force can therefore make no further moves at this time. Not even one. At this rate, Russia's control over the areas it holds will be seriously threatened. One of the key elements that caused the shaking was the Ukrainian army's proximity to the Russian army. Even in the face of extreme difficulty, even the local indigenous people disapproved of the Russian hegemony, armed themselves against the foe. As a consequence, Ukrainian army supporters began to appear in a number of cities. The war was close to being won because the Ukrainian army had taken control of the cities, in large part because of support from their allies. On the other hand, the viewpoints of those who focus on conflict analysis have been hotly debated throughout the world. Conflict analysts think that a major split in the Russian force is about to occur. The main contributing factor in this was by far the reality that they were not treated well in Ukraine. Although many of their most basic needs were not even met where they were serving as soldiers. The confessions and disclosures of captured Russian soldiers who claimed that they were living in better conditions than many Russian army personnel started to lay the groundwork for a great deal of tension within the Russian army. The Russian army became more unstable as a result of this. An increasing number of troops started to willingly hand themselves into the Ukrainian army as a result of the stressful environment. This was treated with great gravity, but given the most recent developments, it is once more clearly evident how bad things are for Putin. There are a lot of hungry individuals in Russia as a result of Putin's unreliable and problematic policies, particularly in light of the recent exodus of Western corporations from Russia. The jobless rate has increased to a completely new level. Many people no longer want to live in Russia as a result of the high unemployment rate. But the reality that those who are unemployed still need to work is by far the most challenging aspect of the situation. It is well known that Russia suffered a serious defeat in Ukraine. It is believed that this defeat directly caused the deaths of about 180,000 soldiers. The demand for priests and grave diggers has dramatically increased as a result of the recent spike in the number of deceased. Therefore, every unemployed individual in Russia is obligated to perform this work. The perception that the economy is getting worse is, however, what is most discouraging. Vladimir Putin ordered a sizable number of people to be drafted into the army as part of the preparations for the conflict, making it one of the most well-known instances of this type of shooting in the entire world. He then declared that if these warriors were slain in battle, he would be as well. The money, to the extent of about 5 million rubles, would be given to their relatives, but there was no money left over to pay the surviving family members of the Russian service members who had been killed in combat because the Russian economy was running a series of budget deficits one after the other. Putin started telling the families of the dead soldiers that their loved ones had either escaped or disappeared. As a consequence, even if the soldiers had actually died, despite the fact that it elicited a strong reaction from the public, the situation greatly undermined Putin's authority. It is anticipated that a government change in Russia will take place very soon if things continue as they are. The Russian people have started to think that these authorities are now in the wrong hands as a result of Putin questioning different Russian authorities. They have consequently started to organize sizable protests and denounce various facets of Putin's policies. Vladimir Putin no longer had even the slightest chance of success against Ukraine as a result of receiving similar reactions from Russian troops as the majority of his operations were in trouble. Putin will have no choice but to tolerate the death rate, which will result in the end of his rule.